So this first presentation will be about understanding the modern world. This will help us understand the themes that we'll be using in class. The tools that we learn in history help us to understand the modern world, how we got here, and why the modern world seems to share European characteristics. This helps us to understand and maybe get our minds around why we are the way we are and begin to think about what we can do to improve the situation of humans on the planet. Our class will include 4 major themes. We'll be asking when, how, and why some parts of the world first industrialized. We'll also be talking about the emergence of nation states as the principal means of social organization. We'll think about the emergence of a global wealth gap, and we'll also try and understand the relationship between the environmental context of events and the way people have interacted with the environment throughout human history. In short, this class is about the story of the modern world, and we'll understand the modern world as happening within the biosphere and understand it in terms of humans reacting to our environment and vice versa. One of the key words that you need to understand in this course is the idea of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a newly accepted geological epoch which is characterized by the idea that humans now have a greater impact on the planet than most other natural or other means of changing the way that the biosphere works. So here's a map, actually a cartogram, of world population in 1500 CE. You can see the distribution of world population by looking at the size of the different territories on the map. You can see, for example, that China in 1500 had the largest population in the world, as it does today. And you can see that South Asia, particularly India, also had one of the largest populations on the planet. Japan also has a very large population, particularly given its land size. And so one of the things that we can say is that in 1500, the largest population was in Asia. The next largest population of humanity was in this territory that we call Europe today. The total population of the world in 1500, though, was between 425 and 540 million people. Today, the total world population is 7.2 billion people. In 2005, when this cartogram was made, world population was 6.75 billion people. So you can see that once again, the largest populations in the world exist in China and in India, and then in Southeast Asia. Japan is quite large, but the share of world population in the Americas has grown. And in terms of its share of world population, Europe has declined somewhat, and Africa's share of world population has increased as well. So these are important population changes over the course of the class that we'll be taking. And there are some other things to understand about world population growth. If we think about it in terms of regions, obviously looking at world population by world regions, Asia has been the largest population center since the year 1820, and actually even since 1500. Asia has been the biggest and now continues to grow faster than anyone else. European population, in terms of its percentage of world population, has remained relatively static. You can see that American population, which is indicated by this pink area right here, is practically non-existent even as late as the middle or the late 1800s. Now if we look over here at population by country, we can see that China's population growth has been by far the fastest since 1900. India's, though, has now the same growth curve, The United States has a relatively high population growth curve as well. Europe and the rest of the world, in terms of its percentage of world population, has remained again relatively static over the last 200, 300, well, in this case, 500 years. Another thing to understand about human populations, and this is easily understood by looking at this map, which is a map of desertification vulnerability, essentially a map that explains to us how rainfall, land quality, and weather patterns affect parts of the globe, is to recognize that the largest population centers exist in less than 25% of the total land mass of the planet. That is to say, our large population centers are all in these areas that are marked off by green, which this map calls humid and not vulnerable. Most of our largest cities exist in these green territories, including in Asia. We have Beijing, we have Shanghai, we have Hong Kong and Macau, we have Tokyo and Osaka, we have Seoul right about here. We have most of Australia's large cities here. Right. We also have the largest cities in Europe, London being roughly here, Paris being roughly here, Berlin being roughly here, New York being roughly in this area, right? Miami here, Chicago right here, Los Angeles sort of in a dangerous area. Other major cities like Seattle in this area. So our major cities and our largest populations all exist in these territories that make up less than 25% of the total land mass of the planet. Those are also the best areas for growing crops, and that is of course what we live by, is food. In this class, we'll also take a look at the difference between nation states, which you can see in this map right here. You can see that we have, for example, France, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Soviet Union, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia up here. All of these states in Europe are nation states, and Europe is the place where nation states came to exist. All right, as compared to the more ancient way of organizing political systems in the world, which was empires, and I've decided to show that using the Roman Empire. That's because you can see that at one point in human history, Europe was encompassed by an empire that was ruled by a single group of people and that had a single official language, and that has changed. So we'll talk about that. We'll also look at the Industrial Revolution, and we'll ask these questions. Why did it begin in Europe, and how? How did it get started? How did it spread? And what were the results of the Industrial Revolution? Those are all key to understanding the modern world. And then we'll finally try and understand the wealth gap. And these different maps hopefully can help you see how the wealth gap works. This is GDP distribution per capita. And the darker purple areas are what we call the developed world. So we have Japan here, Australia here, New Zealand here, the United States and Canada, and Europe in this area. These are all the developed parts of the world which have the highest incomes, and the rest of the world is behind to one degree or another, as you can see in this scale. Another way to look at world distribution of wealth is using this pie chart, where you can see that the United States has fully 1/4 of the world's wealth, making us by far the largest economy. The second largest economy in the world right here is Japan. The third largest economy in the world, China. Those two may have switched places since this was created. This was 2000. And then we have the UK, or Great Britain, Germany, right, Italy. So these are the largest economies in the world in terms of the percentage of global wealth that they control. And this dark area down here, we have in 2000, China, Hong Kong being a single place. Now, of course, the fifth largest economy in the world, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, would be roughly slightly bigger, or slightly bigger than this one, the UK, and that would be California. But there is a great wealth gap between the wealthiest countries and the least wealthy countries, and our question is why? And then finally, we want to understand how human history has occurred within the biosphere, the biosphere being the part of the planet that is livable by humans. The biosphere consists of the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the ecosphere, as you can see in the left here. And we want to see how both human interaction and with the environment and the way that humans have solved human problems has affected the environment, and also vice versa. We're curious how the environment has affected humans and human decisions and problem solving. And then our final question will be, how did these things come to define our world? Because we know that modernity is defined these days in Western terms. Capitalism, nation states, democracy, industrialism, and materialism. And the diffusionist ideology suggests that when a state is having problems, the way for a state to solve its problems is to become more Western, to have more capitalism, more nationalism, more democracy, more industrialism, and more materialism. And these are relatively modern answers to these questions. So we'll be looking into how that idea came to be.